Daniel chapter 1 is where we're going. But first I want to ask you a question. How many of you have ever found yourselves in a hard place? We have a few honest people. And what I mean by hard place, in case you're not entirely sure, a hard place can be if we're talking like the context of your family, it would be the hard place where you constantly don't get along with somebody in your family. There's constant tension there. Maybe they've done something or they're doing something that causes some frustration or conflict between members of your family, and you're standing by watching. Maybe you're in the middle of it and you're just not sure how to handle it. It can be maybe the situation where somebody is constantly criticizing you or attacking you or questioning your beliefs, and so you just find that you're pressed on all sides. It's just a real struggle. This can be something like financially, where you go to work, or maybe you don't go to work, maybe you're retired, and you just find that you're pressed. You've got all these expenses, all these bills, all these things coming up, and you don't like your job, and you don't like the money that you're making. You're not making enough money, and you just feel like you are really stressed on being able to get by on what you have. It can be a social or cultural situation where you go out and you want to live like Christ, but everybody else is pushing you to not live like Christ. And not only are you facing all the trials of dealing with people that are attacking you or persecuting you, but there's all kinds of temptations out there. And you find that the temptations are having a real negative effect on you. And you try to beat them, but you're just hit day after day after day by that same temptation. Some days you win, some days you don't. Some days you win, some days you don't. And you just feel like you're in a hard place when it comes to your own spiritual life. It can be any of those circumstances, or it can be none of those circumstances. It can be all kinds of things. But you've been in that hard place, right? Some sort of place. So, Daniel, chapter 1. Now, the context of this passage is right after Jerusalem has fallen. God has told the people they needed to stop sinning. They needed to stop their idol worship. They needed to turn their lives around. They needed to turn the nation around. And if they weren't going to do that, then he was going to intervene. He was going to allow something terrible to happen. And they didn't change, and something terrible happened. A foreign nation, the Babylonians, they came in and they destroyed the walls, they destroyed everything, and they came in and they captured the population and stole them away. Now, what the Babylonians did at that point is they would take segments of the population and move them to other places in the empire. That way, all the Jews couldn't, or whatever nation they were conquering, they couldn't all get together and mount a rebellion because they were all spread out. And so they would go and they would take the population and move them to different areas of the empire so that they weren't a threat. This would also keep them from rebuilding their city and making their city a threat again. And so they made sure that they would take the population and spread them out. And so this passage in Daniel is dealing with them actually doing that. They are going into the city and they are finding young men and bringing them back to Babylon. I'm starting at verse 3. I'm reading in the Message, so it's going to be a little bit different in most of your translations, but you can follow along, I'm sure. The king told Ashpenaz, head of the palace staff, to get some Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men who were healthy and handsome, intelligent and well educated. Good prospects for leadership positions in the government, perfect specimens. And indoctrinate them in the Babylonian language and the lore of magic and fortune telling. The king then ordered that they be served from the same menu as the royal table, the best food, the finest wine. After 3 years of training, they would be given positions in the king's court. And so 4 young men from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were among those selected. The head of the palace gave them Babylonian names. Daniel was named Belshazzar. Hananiah was named Shadrach. Mishael was named Meshach. And Azariah was named Abednego. But Daniel determined that he would not defile himself by eating the king's food or drinking his wine. So he asked the head of the palace staff to exempt him from the royal diet. The head of the palace staff, by God's grace, liked Daniel. But he warned him, "I'm afraid of what my master, the king, will do. He is the one who has signed this diet, and if he sees that you are not as healthy as the rest, he'll have my head." But Daniel appealed to the steward, who had been assigned to the head of the palace staff to be in charge of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. "Try us out for 10 days on a sample diet of vegetables and water. Then compare us with the young men who eat from the royal menu. Make your decision on the basis of what you see." And so the steward agreed to do it and fed them vegetables and water for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked better and more robust than all the others who had been eating from the royal menu. So the steward continued to exempt them from the royal menu of food and drink and served them only vegetables. And God gave these 4 young men knowledge and skill, both in books and life. And in addition, Daniel was gifted in understanding all sorts of visions and dreams. And at the end of the time set by the king for their training, the head of the royal staff brought them to Nebuchadnezzar. And when the king interviewed them, he found them far superior to all the other young men. None were a match for Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they took their place in the king's service. Whenever the king consulted them on anything, on books or on life, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his kingdom put together. And so we have here a story of Daniel and his friends. We're in a hard place. They have been captured by the invading empire. They have been stolen away from their homes, made slaves, and taken to a foreign nation to serve that foreign nation. And they are confronted with the risk of disobeying a direct order from the king. And they're faced with the risk of, do we go with what the king says, or do we go with what God says? Do we follow the law that the Lord has set before us, or do we give in to what the culture is saying, and do we give in to what the king is demanding of us? Because if we don't do this, then we're dead. And Daniel and his friends decide that they're going to be faithful in that hard situation. They are going to be faithful to God. And so they go ahead and they stick to their guns. They remain faithful, and they come out the other side better than everybody else. And so that relates to us in that you might be in the situation where your family is really frustrating. And you choose to, instead of get even, you choose to be graceful, and you choose to give them opportunities and to hold to what you believe. And you find that you are growing in your faith, and you are a better example by the end of it. Financially, this could mean that You decide to tithe or give to other people or modify your budget in a way that really honors God, even though you're not making any more money. And you find that you can do all those things and the money doesn't run out. This can mean you live your life and you're facing the temptations and you're facing the persecution, and you decide that God is a higher priority and that you're going to do what's necessary to maintain a life of holiness that honors Him. And you actually make progress, and you start seeing victories, and you start seeing changes in your life. But you're still tempted. And you're still persecuted. And the temptations sometimes seem to get worse. And the money doesn't run out, but you're still in a job that you don't like. You still don't have any more money. And you're still just as stressed and frustrated about your money issues. You're more confident when dealing with your family, but there's still conflicts. They still don't trust you. You don't trust them. It's frustrating. You're lost, confused, and they keep making bad decisions that cause more and more problems. And the hard situation doesn't go away. We often read the story of Daniel in different chunks, in different parts, and we make it seem like he's faced with a trial and he gets through it and everything's great. But the last verse of this chapter says, Daniel continued in the king's service until the first year in the reign of King Cyrus. You know what that means? That means that even though Daniel was faithful to God, he was still a slave. He was still a slave to a foreign nation. He was still a captive, stolen away from his home, and he didn't get to go back. Even though Daniel was faithful, even though Daniel did what God wanted him to, Daniel was still a slave, and he was still far away from home, serving the enemy. Even though he did what God wanted him to, he didn't get to leave the hard place. Sometimes we don't get to leave the hard place because that's where the work of God needs to be done most. Sometimes we don't get to leave the hard situations because that's where God has placed us, because that's where things need to get done the most. You might be dealing with your family. You might be making headway, but there's still conflict, there's still frustration. Maybe you're in that hard place because He wants to teach you where your value really is. Or maybe you're there because your family desperately needs to see that no matter what you're going through and no matter what you're facing, there's always hope. And even though they don't ever say anything about it, and even though they don't ever let on, they are just watching. They're just staring at you and your life to see if you're going to cave, see if you're going to slip up, and they're just waiting for a glimpse of hope. Maybe you're in that hard place to learn something. Maybe you're in that hard place because they need you to be like Christ more than any other situation. Financially, maybe you're there to realize that God is the one who provides. Maybe it's a shifting of priority of knowing what is really valuable and what isn't as valuable, and being content in little is and the same as being content in much. Or maybe you're in that situation so that when people look at you, they see how God has provided. Maybe you're in that situation so that you can have a stronger witness that says, I'm not being a Christian because everything is cushy and taken care of, but I'm doing this because this is the truth and this matters the most. Maybe you're in that situation so that when people look at you and they're in a similar situation, you can say, I can relate. I'm dealing with the same thing. Maybe you're in that job with the bad pay and the bad work environment because the people that you're working with need Christ more than anybody else. Maybe you're continue to deal with temptation and frustrations and persecution because God really wants to burn the sin out of you. And He needs you to learn about it, and He needs you to see it, and He needs to really just rid you of all the evil that is sticking there, and He wants you to be aware of it. He wants it dead. Or maybe He's put you there so that you can understand what everybody else is going through too. And so that you can actually minister and relate to other people. He's put you there maybe to keep you humble, so that pride doesn't ever swell in and keep you from actually relating to other people and thinking that you're better than them. Sometimes we don't get to leave the hard places because in those hard places, He's going to work. I don't know if Daniel ever actually left Babylon. You might never get to leave the hard place. You might never get out of the hard situation you're in. But if you're in that hard place, if you're in that hard situation, chances are you're in that hard place because that's where the will of God needs to be done most. And though it's hard, and though it's painful, there's more at stake than our own comfort. The kingdom of God will be advanced. And it's in the hard places that it needs to take ground the most. Maybe you're in the hard place because that's where God needs you to work the most.